Chapter 10. The Philosophy of the Constitution. Introduction. In this book, so far, we have studied some important provisions of our Constitution and the way in which they have worked in the last 69 years. We also studied the way in which the Constitution was made. But have you ever asked yourself why leaders of the national movement felt the need to adopt a constitution after achieving independence from British rule? Why did they choose to bind themselves and the future generations to a constitution? In this book, you have repeatedly visited the debates in the Constituent Assembly, but it should be asked why the study of the Constitution must be accompanied by a deep examination of the debates in the Constituent Assembly. This question will be addressed in this chapter. Secondly, it is important to ask what kind of a constitution we have been given ourselves. What objectives did we hope to achieve by it? Do these objectives have a moral content? If so, what precisely it is? What are the strengths and limitations of this vision, and by implication, the achievements and weaknesses of the Constitution? In doing so, we try to understand what can be called the philosophy of the Constitution. After reading this chapter, you should be able to understand why it is important to study the philosophy of the Constitution. What are the core features of the Indian Constitution? What are the criticisms of this Constitution? And what are the limitations of the Constitution? What is meant by philosophy of the Constitution? Some people believe that a constitution merely consists of laws and that laws are one thing, values and morality quite another. Therefore, we have only a legalistic, not a political philosophy approach of the Constitution. It is true that all laws do not have a moral content, and many laws are closely connected to our deeply held values. For example, a law might prohibit discrimination of persons on grounds of language or religion. Such a law is connected to the idea of equality. Such a law exists because we value equality. Therefore, there is a connection between laws and moral values. We must therefore look upon the Constitution as a document that is based on a certain moral vision. We need to adopt a political philosophy approach to the Constitution. What do we mean by a political philosophy approach to the Constitution? We have three things in mind. First, we need to understand the conceptual structure of the Constitution. What does this mean? It means that we must ask questions like what are the possible meanings of terms used in the Constitution, such as rights, citizenship, minority, or democracy. Furthermore, we must attempt to work out a coherent vision of society and polity conditional upon an interpretation of the key concepts of the Constitution. We must have a better grasp of the set of ideals embedded in the Constitution. Our final point is that the Indian Constitution must be read in conjunction with the Constituent Assembly debates in order to refine and raise to a higher theoretical plane the justification of values embedded in the Constitution. A philosophical treatment of a value is incomplete if a detailed justification for it is not provided. When the framers of the Constitution chose to guide Indian society and polity by a set of values, there must have been a corresponding set of reasons. Many of them, though, may not have been fully explained. A political philosophy approach to the Constitution is needed, not only to find out the moral content expressed in it and to evaluate the claims, but possibly to use it to arbitrate between varying interpretations of the many core values in our polity. It is obvious that many of its ideals are challenged, discussed, debated, and contested in different political arenas, in the legislatures, in party forums, in the press, in schools and universities. These ideals are variously interpreted and sometimes willfully manipulated to suit partisan short-term interests. We must therefore examine whether or not a serious disjunction exists between the constitutional ideal and its expression in other arenas. Sometimes the same ideal is interpreted differently by different institutions. We need to compare these differing interpretations. Since the expression of the ideal in the Constitution has considerable authority, it must be used to arbitrate in conflict of interpretation over values or ideals. Our constitution can perform this job of arbitration. The Japanese Constitution of 1947 is popularly known as the Peace Constitution. The preamble states that we, the Japanese people, desire peace for all time and are deeply conscious of the high ideals controlling human relationship. The philosophy of the Japanese Constitution is thus based on the ideal of peace. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution states, Number 1. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as the sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. Number 2. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential will never maintain. This shows how the context of making the Constitution dominates the thinking of the Constitution makers. Constitution as means of democratic transformation. In the first chapter, we have studied the meaning of term constitution and the need to have a constitution. It is widely agreed that one reason for having constitutions is the need to restrict the exercise of power. Modern states are excessively powerful. They are believed to have a monopoly over force and coercion. What if institutions of such states fall into wrong hands who abuse this power? Even if these institutions were created for our safety and well-being, they can easily turn against us. Experience of state power the world over shows that most states are prone to harming the interests of at least some individuals and groups. If so, we need to draw the rules of the game in such a way that this tendency of states is continuously checked. Constitutions provide these basic rules and therefore prevent states from turning tyrannical. Constitutions also provide peaceful democratic means to bring about social transformation. Moreover, for our hitherto colonized people, constitutions announce and embody the first real exercise of political self-determination. Nehru understood both these points as well. The demands for a constituent assembly, he claimed, represented a collective demand for full self-determination because only a constituent assembly of elected representatives of the Indian people had the right to frame India's constitution without external interference. Second, he argued the Constituent Assembly is not just a body of people or a gathering of able lawyers. Rather, it is a nation of the move, throwing away the shell of its past political and possibly social structure and fashioning for itself a new government of its own making. The Indian Constitution was designed to break the shackles of traditional social hierarchies and to usher in a new era of freedom, equality, and justice. This approach had the potential of changing the theory of constitutional democracy altogether. According to this approach, constitution exists not only to limit people in power but to empower those who traditionally have been deprived of it. Constitutions can give vulnerable people the power to achieve collective good. Why do we need to go back to the Constituent Assembly? Why look backwards and bind ourselves to the past? That may be the job of a legal historian, to go into the past and search for the basis of legal and political ideas. But why should students of politics be interested in studying the intentions and concerns of those who frame the Constitution? Why not take account of changed circumstances and define anew the normative function of the Constitution? In the context of America, where the Constitution was written in the late 18th century, it is absurd to apply the values and standards of that era to the 21st century. However, in India, the world of the original framers and our present day world may not have changed so drastically. In terms of our values, ideals, and conception, we have not separated ourselves from the world of the Constituent Assembly. A history of our Constitution is still very much a history of the present. Furthermore, we have forgotten the real point underlying several of our legal and political practices, simply because somewhere down the road we began to take them for granted. These reasons have now slipped into the background, screened off from our consciousness, even though they still provide the organizational principle to current practices. When the going is good, This forgetting is harmless, but when these practices are challenged for threat or threatened, neglect of the underlying principles can be harmful. In short, to get a handle on current constitutional practice, to grasp their value and meaning, we must have we may have no option but to go back in time to the Constituent Assembly debates and perhaps even further back in time to the colonial era. Therefore, we need to remember and keep revisiting the political philosophy underlying our Constitution. What is the political philosophy of our Constitution? It is hard to describe the philosophy in one word. It resists any single label because it is liberal, democratic, egalitarian, secular, and federal, open to community values, sensitive to the needs of religious and linguistic minorities, as well as historically disadvantaged groups, and committed to building a common national identity. In short, it is committed to freedom, equality, social justice, and some form of national unity. But underneath all this, there is a clear emphasis on peaceful and democratic measures for putting this philosophy into practice. Individual freedom. The first point to note about the Constitution is its commitment to individual freedom. This commitment did not emerge miraculously out of calm deliberations around a table. Rather, it was the product of continuous intellectual and political activity of well over a century. As early as the beginning of the 19th century, Ram Mohan Roy protested against curtailment of the freedom of the press by the British colonial state. Roy argued that a state responsive to the needs of individuals must provide them the means by which their needs are communicated. Therefore, the state must permit unlimited liberty of publication. Likewise, Indians continued to demand a free press throughout the British rule. It is not surprising, therefore, that freedom of expression is an integral part of the Indian Constitution. So, is the freedom from arbitrary arrest, after all, the infamous Rowlatt Act, which the national movement opposed so vehemently, sought to deny this basic freedom? These and other individual freedoms, such as freedom of conscience, are part of the liberal ideology. On this basis, we can say that the Indian Constitution has a pretty strong liberal character. In the chapter on fundamental rights, we have already seen how the Constitution values individual freedom. It might be recalled that for over 40 years before the adoption of the Indian Constitution, every single revolution, scheme, bill, and report of the Indian National Congress mentioned individual rights not just in passing but as a non negotiable value. Social justice. When we say that the Indian Constitution is liberal, we do not mean that it is liberal only in the classical Western sense. In the book on political theory, you will learn more about the idea of liberalism. Classical liberalism always privileges rights of the individuals over the demands of social justice and community values. The liberalism of the Indian Constitution differs from this version in two ways. First, it was always linked to social justice. The best example of this is the provision of reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Constitution. The makers of the Constitution believed that mere granting of the right to equality was not enough in overcoming age-old injustices suffered by these groups or to give real meaning to their rights to vote. Special constitutional measures were required to advance their interests. Therefore, the constitution makers provided a number of special measures to protect the interests of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, such as the reservation of seats in legislatures. The Constitution also made it possible for the government to reserve public sector jobs for these groups. Indian liberalism has two streams. The first stream began with Ram Mohan Roy. He emphasized individual rights, particularly the rights of women. The second stream included thinkers like K.C. Sen, Justice Rennet, and Swami Vivekananda. They introduced the spirit of social justice with In Orthodox Hinduism, for Vivekananda, such a reordering of Hindu society could not have been possible without liberal principles. Respect for diversity and minority rights. The Indian Constitution encourages equal respect between communities. This was not easy in our country. First, because communities do not always have a relationship of equality. They tend to have a hierarchical relationships with one another. Second, when these communities do see each other as equals, they also tend to become rivals. This was a huge challenge for the makers of the Constitution, how to make communities liberal in their approach and foster a sense of equal respect among them under existing conditions of hierarchy or intense rivalry. It would have been very easy to resolve the problem by not recognizing communities at all, as most Western liberal constitutions do, but this would have been unworkable and undesirable in our country. This was not because Indians are attached to communities more than others. Individuals everywhere also belong to cultural communities, and every such community has its own values, traditions, customs, and language shared by its members. For example, individuals in France or Germany belong to a linguistic community and are deeply attached to it. What makes us different is that we have more openly not acknowledged the value of communities. More importantly, India is a land of multiple cultural communities. Unlike Germany or France, we have several linguistic and religious communities. It was important to others. It was important to ensure that no one community systematically dominates others, that no one community it was important to ensure that no one community systematically dominates others. This made it mandatory for our Constitution to recognize community based rights. One such right is the right of religious communities to establish and run their own educational institutions. Such institutions may receive money from the government. This provision shows that the Indian Constitution does not see religion merely as a private matter concerning the individual. Secularism. Secular states are widely seen as treating religion as only a private matter. That is to say, they refuse to give religion public or official recognition. Does this mean that Indian constitution is not secular? This does not follow. Though the term secular was not initially mentioned, the Indian constitution has not always been secular. The mainstream Western conception of secularism means mutual exclusion of state and religion in order to protect values such as individual freedom and citizenship rights of individuals. Again, this is something that you will learn more in political theory. The term mutual exclusion means this: both religion and state must stay away from the internal affairs of one another. The state must not intervene in the domain of religion. Religion, likewise, should not dictate state policy or influence the conduct of the state. In other words, mutual exclusion means that religion and state must be strictly separated. What is the purpose behind strict separation? It is to safeguard the freedom of individuals. States which lend support to organized religions make them more powerful than they already are. When religious organizations begin to control the religious lives of individuals, when they start dictating how they should relate to God or how they should pray, individuals may have the option of turning to the modern state for protecting their religious freedoms. But what help would a state offer if it has already joined hands with these organizations? To protect religious freedom of individuals, therefore, state must not help religious organizations, but at the same time, state should not tell organizations how to manage their affairs. That too can thwart religious freedom. The state must, therefore, not hinder religious organizations either. In short, states should neither help nor hinder religions. Instead, they should keep themselves at an arm's length from them. This has been the prevalent Western conception of secularism. Conditions in India were different, and to respond to the challenge they posed, the makers of the constitution had to work out an alternative conception of secularism. They departed from the Western model in two ways and for two different reasons. Rights of religious groups. First, as mentioned already, they recognized that inter-community equality was as necessary as equality between individuals. This was because a person's freedom and sense of self-respect was directly dependent upon the status of our community. If one community was dominated by another, then its members would also be significantly less free. If, on the other hand, the relations were equal, marked by the absence of domination, then its members would also walk about with dignity, self respect, and freedom. Thus, the Indian Constitution grants rights to all religious communities, such as the right to establish and maintain their educational institutions. Freedom of religion in India means the freedom of religion of both individuals and communities. States' power of intervention. Second, separation in India could not mean mutual exclusion. Why is it so? Because religiously sanctioned customs such as untouchability deprive individuals of the most basic dignity and self respect. Such customs were so deeply rooted and pervasive that without active state intervention there was no hope of their dissolution. The state simply had to interfere in the affairs of religion. Such intervention was not always negative. The state could not always help religious communities by giving to educational institutions run by them. In India, separation between religion and state did not mean their mutual exclusion, but rather principled distance, a rather complex idea that allows the state to be distant from all religion so that it can intervene or abstain from interference, depending upon which of these would be better to promote liberty, equality, and social justice. We have hitherto mentioned three core features. These can also be seen as achievements of our Constitution. First, our Constitution reinforces and reinvents forms of liberal individualism. This is an important achievement because this is done in the backdrop of a society where community values are often indifferent or hostile to individual autonomy. Second, our Constitution upholds the principle of social justice without compromising on individual liberties. The constitutional commitment to caste based affirmative action program shows how much ahead India was compared to other nations. Can one forget that affirmative action programs in the US were begun after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, almost 2 decades after they were constitutionally entrenched in India? Third, against the background of intercommunal strife, the Constitution upholds its commitment to group rights. This indicates that the framers of the Constitution were more than willing to face the challenges of what more than 4 decades later has come to be known as multiculturalism. Universal franchise. Two other core features may also be regarded as achievements. First, it is no mean achievement to commit oneself to universal franchise, especially when there is widespread belief that traditional hierarchies in India are congealed and more or less impossible to eliminate, and when the right to vote has only recently been extended to women and to the working class in stable Western democracies. Once the idea of a nation took root among the elite, the idea of democratic self government followed. Thus, Indian nationalism always conceived of a political order based on the will of every single member of society. The idea of a universal franchise lay securely within the heart of nationalism. As early as the Constitution of India Bill, the first non official attempt at drafting a constitution for India, the author declared that every citizen, that is, anyone born in India, had a right to take part in the affairs of the country and be admitted to public office. The Motilal Nehru report reaffirms this conception of citizenship, reiterating that every person of either sex who has attained the age of 21 is entitled to vote for the House of Representatives or Parliament. Thus, from very early on, universal franchise was considered as the most important and legitimate instrument by which the will of the nation was to be properly expressed. Federalism. Second, by introducing the articles concerning Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast, the Indian Constitution anticipates the very important concept of asymmetric federalism. We have seen in the chapter on federalism that the Constitution has created a strong central government, but despite this unitary bias of the Indian Constitution, there are important constitutionally embedded differences between the legal status and the prerogatives of different subunits within the same federation. Unlike the constitutional symmetry of American federalism, Indian federalism has been constitutionally asymmetric. To meet the specific needs and requirements of some subunits, it was always part of the original design to have a unique relationship with them or to give them special status. For example, the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to the Indian Union was based on a commitment to safeguard its autonomy under Article 370 of the Constitution. This is the only state that is governed by its own constitution. Similarly, under Article 371A, the privilege of special status was also accorded to the northeast state of Nagaland. The article not only confers validity on pre existing laws within Nagaland, but also protects local identity through restrictions on immigration. Many other states too are beneficiaries of such special provisions. According to the Indian Constitution, then, there is nothing bad about this differential treatment. Although the Constitution did not originally envisage this, India is now a multilingual federation. Each major linguistic group is politically recognized and all are treated as equals. Thus, the democratic and linguistic federalism of India has managed to combine claims to unity with claims to cultural recognition. A fairly robust political arena exists that allows for the play of multiple identities that complement one another. National identity. Thus, the Constitution constantly reinforces a common national identity. In the chapter of federalism, you have studied how India strives to retain regional identities along with national identity. It is clear from what is mentioned above that this common national identity was not incompatible with distinct religious or linguistic identities. The Indian Constitution tried to balance these various identities, yet, preference was given to common identity under certain conditions. This is clarified in the debate over separate electorates based on religious identity, which the Constitution rejects. Separate electorates were rejected not because they fostered difference between religious communities as such or because they endangered a simple notion of national unity, but because they endangered a healthy national life. Rather than force unity, our Constitution sought to evolve true fraternity, a goal dear to the heart of Dr. Ambedkar. As Sardar Patel puts it, the main objective was to evolve one community. But in the long run, it would be in the interest of all to forget that there is anything like majority or minority in this country and that in India there is only one community. Sardar Patel, CAD, Volume 8, page 272, 25th May 1949. Procedural achievements. All these five core features are what might be called as substantive achievements of the Constitution. However, there were also some procedural achievements. First, the Indian Constitution reflects a fate in political deliberation. We know that many groups and interests were not adequately represented in the Constituent Assembly, but the debates in the Assembly amply show that the makers of the Constitution wanted to be as inclusive in their approach as possible. This open ended approach indicates the willingness of people to modify their existing preferences. In short, to justify outcomes by reference not just self interest but to reasons. It also shows a willingness to recognize creative value in difference and disagreement. Second, it reflects a spirit of compromise and accommodation. These words, compromise and accommodation, should not always be seen with disapproval. Not all compromises are bad. If something of value is traded off for mere self interest, then we naturally have compromise in the bad sense. However, if one value is partially traded off for another value, especially in the open process of free deliberation among equals, then the compromise arrived in this manner can hardly be objected to. We may lament that we cannot have everything, but to secure a bit of all things important cannot be morally blameworthy. Besides, a commitment to the idea that decisions on the most important issues must be arrived at consensually rather than by majority vote is equally morally commendable. Criticisms. The Indian Constitution can be subjected to many criticisms, of which three may be briefly mentioned. First, that is unwieldy. Second, that is unrepresentative. And third, that it is alien to our conditions. The criticisms that it is unwieldy is based on the assumption that the entire constitution of a country must be found in one compact document. But this is not true even of countries such as the US, which do not have a compact constitution. The fact is that a country's constitution is to be identified with a compact document and with other written documents with constitutional status. Thus, it is possible to find important constitutional statements and practices outside one compact document. In the case of India, many such details, practices, and statements are included in one single document, and this has made that document somewhat large in size. Many countries, for instance, do not have provisions for election commission or the civil service commissioned in the document known as Constitution. But in India, many such matters are attended by the Constitution document itself. A second criticism of the Constitution is that it is unrepresentative. Do you remember how the Constituent Assembly was formed? At that time, adult franchise was not yet granted, and most members came from the advanced sections of the society. Does this make our Constitution unrepresentative? Here we must distinguish two components of representation, one that might be called voice and the other opinion. The voice component of representation is important. People must be recognized in their own language or voice, not in the language of the masters. If we look at the Indian Constitution from this dimension, it is indeed underrepresentative because members of the Constituent Assembly were chosen by a restricted franchise, not by a universal suffrage. However, if we examine the other dimension, we may not find it altogether lacking in representativeness. The claim that almost every shade of opinion was represented in the Constituent Assembly may be a trifle exaggerated, but may have something to it. If we read the debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly, we find that a vast range of issues and opinions were mentioned. Members raised matters not only based on the individual social concerns, but based on the perceived interests and concerns of various social sections as well. Is it a coincidence that Central Square of every other small town has a statue of Dr. Ambedkar with a copy of the Indian Constitution? Far from being a mere symbolic tribute to him, this expresses the feeling among Dalits that the Constitution reflects many of their aspirations. A final criticism alleges that the Indian Constitution is entirely an alien document, borrowed article by article from Western constitutions, and sits uneasily with the cultural ethos of the Indian people. This criticism is often voiced by many. Even in the Constituent Assembly itself, there were some voices that echo this concern. How far is this charge true? It is true that the Indian Constitution is modern and partly Western. Do you remember that in the first chapter we have listed the various sources from which our Constitution borrowed? But in this chapter you have also seen that it was never a blind borrowing. It was innovative borrowing. Besides, as we shall see, this does not make it entirely alien. First, many Indians have not only adopted modern ways of thinking, but have made these their own. For them, westernization became a form of protest against the filth in their own tradition. Ram Mohan Roy started this trend and it continued to this day by Dalits. Indeed, as early as 1841, it was noticed that the Dalit people of northern India were not afraid to use the newly introduced legal system and bring suits against their landlords. So, this new instrument of protest against the filth in their own tradition, Ram Mohan Roy started this trend and it is continued to this day by Dalits. Indeed, as early as 1841, it was noticed that the Dalit people of northern India were not afraid to use the newly introduced legal system and bring suits against their landlords. So, this new instrument of modern law was effectively adopted by the people to address questions of dignity and justice. Second, when Western modernity began to interact with local cultural systems, something like a hybrid culture began to emerge, possibly by creative adaptation, but for which a parallel can be found neither in modern Western modernity nor in indigenous tradition. This cluster of newly developed phenomenon forged out of Western modern and indigenous traditional cultural systems have the character of a different alternative modernity. In a non Western societies, different modernities emerged as a non Western societies tried to break loose not only from their own past practices but also from the shackles of a particular version of Western modernity imposed on them. Thus, when we were drafting our constitution, efforts were made to amalgamate Western and traditional Indian values. It was a process of selective adaptation and not borrowing. Limitations. All this is not to say that Constitution of India is perfect and flawless document. Given the social conditions within which the Constitution was made, it was only natural that there may be many controversial matters, that there would be many areas that needed careful revision. There are many features of this Constitution that have emerged mainly due to exigencies of the time. Nonetheless, we must admit that there are many limitations to this Constitution. Let us briefly mention the limitations of the Constitution. First, the Indian Constitution has a centralized idea of national unity. Second, it appears to have glossed over some important issues of gender justice, particularly within the family. Third, it is not clear why in a poor developing country certain basic socio-economic rights were relegated to the section of directive principles rather than made an integral feature of our fundamental rights. It is possible to give answers to these limitations, to explain why this happened, or even to overcome them, but that is not our point. We are arguing that these limitations are not serious enough to jeopardize the philosophy of the Constitution. Conclusion. In the previous chapter, we described the Constitution as a living document. It is these core features of the Constitution that give it the stature of a living document. Legal provisions and institutional arrangements depend upon the needs of the society and the philosophy adopted by the society. The Constitution gives expression to this philosophy. The institutional arrangements that we studied throughout the book are based on a core and commonly agreed vision. That vision has historically emerged through our struggle for independence. The Constituent Assembly was the platform on which this vision was stated, refined, and articulated in legal institutional form. Thus, the Constitution becomes the embodiment of this vision. Many people have said that the best summary of this vision or the philosophy of the Constitution is to be found in the preamble of the Constitution. Have you carefully read the preamble? Apart from various objectives mentioned in it, the preamble makes a very humble claim. The Constitution is not given by a body of great men. It is prepared and adopted by we, the people of India. Thus, the people are themselves the makers of their own destinies. And democracy is the instrument that people have used for shaping their present and their future. More than 5 decades since the Constitution was drafted, we have fought over many matters. We have seen that the courts and the governments have disagreed on many interpretations. The center and the states have many differences on opinion, and political parties have fought bitterly. As you will study next year, our politics has been full of problems and shortcomings, and yet, if you ask the politician or the common citizen, you will find that everyone continues to share in that famous vision embodied in the Constitution. We want to live together and prosper together on the basis of principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. This sharing in the vision or the philosophy of the Constitution is the valuable outcome of the working of the Constitution. In 1950, making of this Constitution was a great achievement. Today, keeping alive the philosophical vision of that Constitution may be our important achievement.